So good evening, everybody, or good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name's Sam, and I'll be chairing today's fundraising lecture entitled All the Rekhyt People Adore by Dr. Ken Griffin. I know a few of you have been waiting for this lecture for a long time. We've now turned off the chat, so you will now, as Ken says, only be able to message me and Ken, and I'll pick up and do my best to help with any technical difficulties you're having. If you have questions for Ken, please make them as difficult as possible, and you'll be able to pop those in the Q&A section, and I'll read those out to Ken at the end. So it's my very, very, very great pleasure to introduce my dear friend Ken. Dr. Kenneth Griffin is Collections Access Manager at the Egypt Centre at Swansea University. His association with the Egypt Centre first began in 2000 as a volunteer. Over the past 2 decades, he has been researching the collection, publishing a number of the objects, and prior to his appointment as the Collections Access Manager, he was a lecturer of Egyptology at Swansea University. He's also participated in excavations in Egypt at Abydos, South Africa Sea, and also in the Valley of the Kings. He's also worked on Sai Island in the Sudan, and many of you know him from the fantastic online courses he's been doing for the last nearly a year now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not even going to try and introduce the Rekhyt people because Ken will tell me I've got everything wrong. I'm not even going to try. So thank you so much, Ken, for giving your time today, and take it away.
Thank you, and I assume that everybody can hear and see me, since there was a bit of an issue at the beginning, I think, with hearing Sam, but hopefully that was just a one-off and that it's all fine. Since I don't see anything coming up on the chat, hopefully that's a good thing and people can hear and see me. So today, I'm going to be giving this talk that I've been promising to do for 8 months or so on the Rekhyt people, which was the topic of both my MA as well as my PhD dissertation. And my PhD, which finished in 2014, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So what I'll be talking about today is really about 17 years of research that I've been doing on the Rekhyt people since I started my MA back in 2004. And then finishing with my PhD in 2014. Of course, although I've finished those studies, the Rekhyt people are still very much a part of me, something I do always look for when I'm in Egypt, as well as in publications, etc. And I know that there are people who are joining us today who probably have no idea who or what the Rekhyt people are and why this kind of quote, all the Rekhyt people adore, what that's all about. Many of you will, those of you that have been to Egypt perhaps, or that have done courses on Egyptology, but I know that there are some of you who will be unfamiliar with that, and that's hopefully fine. The advertisement for this course showed you this, this beautiful picture that was produced over 100 years ago by Charles Whymper, a well-known illustrator of birds. And it really sums up the Rekhyt quite well. We have the 2 lapwings that you can see on the left-hand side with their distinctive crests. But in the background, you also have another one of the lapwings, this time with human arms raised in adoration, the representation of the so-called Rekhyt people, which will be the topic of today's lecture. Now, as I was saying just before the talk started, it is quite a long one. I've got about 170 or so slides, and that was after cutting out quite a lot. There's a lot about the Rekhyt people, as you'll see in tonight's talk. But we will take a break roughly halfway through, I would say, so probably after about 50 minutes or so. We'll have a quick 5-minute break if anybody doesn't want to sit through a full hour-and-a-half or so of a lecture. My PhD thesis was published in a reworked format just a few years ago called All the Rekhyt People Adore, which is a common inscription that you hear in Egypt, or see in Egypt, I should say, which looked at the role of the Rekhyt people in ancient Egyptian religion. And this was published by Wolfram Gajewski and his publication house, Golden House Egyptology, or Golden House Press. And I will be giving you more details about this at the last slide because I've spoken to Wolfram and he's very happy to give a nice discount on this publication. So for my thesis, there were a number of questions that I really focused on. Who the Rekhyt people were. This is actually the most difficult question, and one that I still really don't have a full answer for. There's lots of different proposals, of which I'll run through them with you, as well as perhaps some other new interpretations of who the rekhyt people might be from carrying out my study. What did the rekhyt people do? Well, you will have seen them in the depiction at the beginning, where they have the human hands raised in adoration. And that's certainly their most common way to find them depicted. But what does that actually mean? And that fits on to the question of, when did the rekhyt people perform their actions of maintenance? Their actions of maintenance being their adoration, their jubilation, and various other actions, emotions, and gestures that you commonly hear them performing in these texts. And I will show you quite a lot of texts in tonight's lecture. Where did they perform them? So were they in temples, in the houses, in the tombs, etc.? And why? And then in the second part of the lecture, after the break, we'll look at the function of the rekhyt rebus. Now, the rekhyt rebus is a very common monograph, which you see down at the bottom here, which is made up of a number of different hieroglyphs. I'll come on to that in greater detail at the very end, but it's very well known in ancient Egyptian art. It's basically what you have is a combination of hieroglyphs that look like it's a simple picture, but it can be translated from the hieroglyphs into a specific saying, i.e. all the rekhyt people adore. So that's the rebus that we'll focus on in the second half of the lecture. And you'll find the rekhyt everywhere in the form of lapwings, as we have in this object, which is now in the Louvre. I'll be showing you quite a lot of pictures, different things of the rekhyt, but you will spot them everywhere probably after this lecture. And certainly when you go to Egypt, every temple that you go into, you'll probably find a rekhyt somewhere. For my study, really, I covered all aspects of the rekhyt. So from the proto-dynastic period of roughly 3200 BC through to the Roman period, roughly 300 AD. So you're talking 3,500 years, which was the scope of my study. And it's during this time that you do have the rekhyt people depicted, or at least the lapwing depicted. So it's one of the most enduring symbols and iconography in Egyptian art. And even the geographical distribution. They are from the northern side of Tapazaris Magna on the Mediterranean coast, right down to the Nubian site of Jebel Barkal. So it has a very wide chronological time frame, as well as a very wide geographical scope. And I looked at both textual and iconographical sources. And it is important, I think, as Egyptologists, that we don't just focus on one of the other, one of just the texts or just the iconography. You have to look at both at the same time in order to better understand it. Some Egyptologists may focus specifically on texts when they're looking at, let's say, a statue, without actually going to look at the statue itself that might be in a museum or on display in Egypt. And it's always vital that you look at both of them and certainly try to understand the object much better. So during the course of my study, I gathered together over 2,000 attestations of the word rekhyt, which is obviously quite a vast amount of texts. The number keeps on rising, of course, since my study was concluded. So I think now I've got around about 2,300 or so attestations of the word. So it's very common in Egyptian language as well as iconography. And for my main study on the rekhyt people, I looked at 441 core texts, much more than what anyone else had done in terms of looking at the rekhyt people. And there had been a few much smaller studies on the rekhyt people over the last 100 years, but nothing as detailed as what I was able to do. Obviously, the rekhyt people is synonymous with the lapwing bird, which you commonly see in ancient Egyptian art. So in this representation from the tomb of Amenemhat, Theban tomb 82, on the west bank of Luxor, dating to the 18th dynasty, you can see a series of birds, two of which are lapwings. You can see their very distinctive crests on top of their heads. Now, I must confess, I know absolutely nothing about birds themselves. Probably if I seen a rekhyt in front of me or a lapwing in front of me, I wouldn't even be able to say for sure whether it was a lapwing. But thankfully, an ornithologist, John Wyatt, has been quite helpful in terms of identifying the types of lapwings that you had in ancient Egypt. And contrary to the popular belief that there was only one lapwing, John has been able to determine that there were actually two. The first one is the northern lapwing, which you can see on the right-hand side here, next to the same type of lapwing on the left-hand side, which is from the from the Red Chapel of Hachipset that you have at the Open Air Museum in Karnak. You can see in particular the band on the chest, which is very distinctive and comes down there. And then there's the black-headed plover. So a slightly different form of the lapwing. This is it in a hieroglyph dating to the 12th dynasty, which can be found at Beni Hassan. So you have to look sometimes at individual hieroglyphs rather than the iconography that you might have in the marshes to see whether there's a distinction between the two birds. Now, in general, we don't know whether the Egyptians distinguished between the two of them in terms of giving them their names, and we don't even know properly what the Egyptian name for the lapwing was. But we can assume, or at least propose, that it must have been rekhyt, or at least the root of it. So what do people think about the rekhyt people, who they may have been? Well, they've certainly been discussed for 200 years of Egyptian literature. Some of the earliest sources to really discuss the rekhyt people were Champollion. And the earliest people really seen them as being pure spirits, that they were otherworldly beings. Probably not too surprising given the fact that you have these birds with human hands. They're mythical creatures. But why pure? Well, this probably goes to the root of the word rek or rekhyt, rekhyt, which means to wash, to be pure. And you can see from the various quotes here what people have often identified them as being, such as Parmer 150 years ago, who describes them as the human souls purified at the end of their wandering. What these scholars don't usually say is what their evidence is based upon. So where's Parmer getting this interpretation from? Sir Peter Lapage-Renouf in 1881, who wrote extensively on the Book of the Dead, describes the Pat people. Now, these are three groups of mankind as they're usually identified as: the Pat people, rekhyt people, and Henmemet people. And he identifies the Pat as the past, the generations past, the rekhyt people as the present, and the Henmemet people as the future. But once again, he doesn't show any evidence as to why he comes to this conclusion. And it's certainly not an interpretation that was accepted by many other Egyptologists of his day, and certainly isn't today. But it really expresses how difficult Egyptologists, the difficulty Egyptologists had with trying to identify who the rekhyt people may have been. And you can see this in the publications of Budge. Many of you will know that Budge wrote extensively on ancient Egypt, hundreds of books back 100 years ago. And here's just a few translations that he's given in his publications on the rekhyt people. He describes the Henmemet people as the gentry, the intelligent and instructed classes as the rekhyt people, and the peasant laborers as the slaves in the Pat. Well, interestingly, Egyptologists will usually put the rekhyt people as being the lower class citizens and the Pat people as being the elite. So here, Budge has got it the opposite way around. But he also describes them as people living in heaven, mankind, mortals, living people, rational beings, men of understanding, spiritual beings. As you can see, he had real difficulty trying to pinpoint exactly who these rekhyt people, or lapwing people, as some people call them, may have been. From the mid-1800s through to the early 20th century, Egyptologists would commonly describe the rekhyt people as knowledgeable beings. And this is based on the root of the word rekhyt, rek, which means to know, which suggests that they know some kind of restricted knowledge, that they are knowledgeable individuals. And there's just a few people who have proposed that. Then 100 years ago, we had Bassam Gunn, who suggested in 1926 that the rekhyt people were a group of Egyptians who were living in the north of Egypt, in the Delta region. And this was based primarily on the scorpion mace head, which is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which you can see on the right-hand side. Now, the mace head itself depicts a pharaoh, or at least it's believed to, called Scorpion, who was a ruler around about 3200, 3100 BC. But if you look very closely up the top, you've got these lapwings which are hanging on nooses. And Egyptologists interpreted this as a representation of Scorpion, a king from the south, who had conquered the north, and that these are northerners who are hanging on the nooses. Certainly makes some kind of sense, at least for the unification of Egypt and in the interpretation that Egyptologists have often said about the unification of Egypt, how the southern country of Egypt conquered the north. And Pirani in 1934 described them as being the urban population, particularly in the Delta. So there was this focus on the Delta for several decades. But what evidence is there to support this, other than the scorpion mace head? Well, there's very little evidence. And in fact, there's certainly no inscriptional evidence to say that the rekhyt people were exclusively from the north of Egypt. That's not to rule it out altogether, as I'll come on to in just a second. There was also a coffin fragment that was published in 1958. And here it is. The drawing was published in 1958. The fragment itself had disappeared for a number of years and then re-emerged recently. And there it is on the right-hand side where you can see the actual thing. So you may be looking at this and thinking, well, where are the rekhyt people? What you've got here is a representation of the world based on how the Egyptians perceived it. And they did actually see it in this representation as being round. You had this round oval, of which we've only got part of it. And you've got all of these regions, seemingly the gnomes on either side. But down at the bottom, you've got three figures, just partially preserved, with human heads, but with crests, similar to the lapwings. And in this map, they're associated with the Delta region. So this could potentially be some kind of evidence that we're dealing with the rekhyt people being in the Delta. But like I said, other than this, the scorpion mace head, we really have no concrete evidence to say that they were from the Delta region. And certainly, by the time we get to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, it's very clear in the inscriptional evidence, inscriptional sources, that they're not just in the area of Lower Egypt, i.e. in the north. And here's an inscription which dates to the reign of Montuhotep IV, the great expedition that was carried out by the vizier Amenemhat when he goes into the Wadi Hammamat and two wonders or miracles take place. Well, here he's describing one of them, and he says that the wonder, may be heard by those who are in Egypt, the rekhyt people who are in both Upper and Lower Egypt. So here you can see this inscription dating to around about 2000 BC, that if the rekhyt people are originally people of the Delta, by at least 2000 BC, they're no longer restricted to the Delta. As I said, it might still be possible that in the pre-dynastic period, 3000 BC, they were originally restricted to the north of Egypt in the Delta. But as time went on, their meaning changed. And that's something to keep in mind, that the identity of the rekhyt people may not have been exactly the same for 3,500 years of Egyptian history. It may have changed and evolved over time. Another interpretation put forward by Victor Larrey in 1906 was that they were the followers of the god Seth. He describes the Pot people as the followers of Horus, the rekhyt people as the followers of Seth, and the Hen-Mehmet people as the followers of Osiris. And although he didn't give any evidence or any inscriptions or sources to back this up, during the course of my research, I was able to find 3 texts, so 3 texts out of 2,000, that potentially hint at an association between the rekhyt people and Seth. Here's a fragmentary inscription that we have from Komombo, which dates to the Roman period. You can see it's very much destroyed, so we've got something for Horus. Maybe it's the Pot people for Horus, the rekhyt people for Seth, and the Hen-Mehmet people maybe for Osiris. Perhaps this inscription was better preserved, at least in Larrey's day, and he was able to interpret it this way, or maybe he's just simply made it up. Who knows? But we have 2 passages in the dream book, unfortunately very badly damaged and heavily reconstructed. This is dating to the Ramesside period, so from around about 1100 BC, 1200, 1100 BC. And it says, the god within him is Seth. As for a man, unfortunately we have a gap, he is a man of the rekhyt people. And another passage from it, a man of the rekhyt people, his lifetime is for Seth. What does this mean? How do we interpret this? It's difficult to really know, because the dream book is an interpretation of various dreams in the Ramesside period, and not all of them make sense, at least not to our eyes, our Western perspective. We don't know how the Egyptians would have interpreted this. And does this really link the rekhyt people with the god Seth? As I say, 3 out of 2,000 inscriptions is not much. They're commonly described as being rebellious foreigners by Egyptologists. And it's usually the negative characteristics of the rekhyt people that are highlighted most. Included in an article that came out about 20 years ago now on the rekhyt people in the pyramid texts, in which the author really selected just about 20 or 30 inscriptions and showed that the rekhyt people were clearly these rebellious foreigners. But what evidence is there for that? How many inscriptions really describe them in this negative capacity? Well, here's a passage from the pyramid texts, and it says that Geb shall hack up for him, that's Pepi, the king, Asia's fortresses. He shall clear away from him the hostile rekhyt people from under his fingers. So in this text, the rekhyt people are described as being hostile. And in case I forget a little bit later, you can see from the determinatives that have been used here, the classifiers that come after the word for rekhyt, that it's representing both a male and a female. This rebellious foreigners or subjects of the king is still very much something that you come across in Egyptological literature. They're described as the Untertanen, the subjects of the king. Why? Well, we've got these few inscriptions, but we also have statue bases, such as what we have on the right-hand side. This dates to the 3rd dynasty of the pharaoh Djoser, the builder of the owner of the first pyramid in Egypt, the step pyramid at Saqqara. We've got the feet of the king with 9 bows representing the traditional enemies of the Egyptians. And the king is trampling on top of these bows, showing that he has subjugated these foreign lands. While directly in front of him, you have these 3 lapwings. Now, although there's no inscription at this point identifying them as the rekhyt people, I think it's very clear from the iconography that comes afterwards that they should be interpreted as being the people rather than just birds. But it's important to note that while you do commonly find the rekhyt people on the basis of statues, often in association with the 9 bows, While you see the king trampling the 9 bows, showing that he is in control, you never see the king trampling the lapwings, the rekhyt people. And that's important to note. So I'll show you a few as we go on. Here's another statue base that we have. So the statue of the king would have gone directly on top of this. And you can see we have these 2 foreigners with their heads sticking out, a clear indication that the king is standing on top of these conquered areas. And we've even got the names of the conquered lands written just next to it. So it's telling us who we're dealing with. Whereas the lapwings, you can see they're not trampled. Instead, they've got their arms raised in adoration. So I think that they shouldn't be interpreted so much as being these subjugated people as much as the foreigners are in these statue bases. And it's also important to note that although people have often highlighted the negative characteristics of the rekhyt people, inscriptional wise, they're very limited. Out of 2,000, only 57, which is 3% of the texts, interpret the rekhyt people in a negative capacity as being rebellious and so on, that need to be controlled. And usually when they do appear as these rebellious foreigners, if you want to call them that, or people that need to be subjugated, it's usually is part of a text of a long list of other beings who need to be controlled at the same time, such as what we have on the right-hand side from the Chester Beatty papyrus, dating to around about 1100 BC. If we look at this text, it's a magical protective text that we've got here. So usually you'll find them in charms, and it says, "O Lord of millions, whose name is not known, O ye gods, lords of heaven, come ye, in order that the name of the owner, born of such and such, may be purified from everything done against him on this day, in this night, in this month, in this hour, in this year, and that every evil be driven from him, and there shall not take effect anything that is done against him." So it's basically requesting that the deceased person be protected on every day of the year against anybody who could harm him. And it goes on to list the various people: the Remech people, the Pat people, the rekhyt people, Henmemet people, by the foreigners of the southern, northern, western, eastern, by males and females, by any male magicians and female magicians whose hearts are ill-disposed towards the deceased, born of such and such, and who wreak vengeance upon him by handing him over to god or goddess, to make him eat what he abominates, and to bewitch his heart in his body. So you can see from this text that the rekhyt people are not being singled out as being these bad people, at least not individually. But this text is including almost everybody who could potentially be rebellious. And of course, anybody has the potential to be rebellious. Many of you that have studied Egyptology before will know the tale of the destruction of mankind, in which mankind rebels against the gods. The word that is used there is Remech, which we have here. So the Remech people rebel against the gods. The rekhyt people could. Anybody could, to a certain extent. The most widely held interpretation of who the rekhyt people are is that they are the populace of Egypt. They are a group of Egyptians living in Egypt. Griffith in 1900, he describes them as the first of 3 classes, not yet finally explained, into which the Egyptians are divided. And this is when we start to get the idea that the Pat people, the rekhyt people, and the Henmemet people were 3 different social classes. And it's important that when we look at these texts, that we try not to put our own Western perspective on that. Usually, Egyptologists will describe them as being commoners, the common people, plebs, or to give it a neutral title, the lapwing folk. I usually call them the rekhyt people, since it doesn't give any connotation as to who the rekhyt people actually are. It's more of this neutral term. Are they really commoners? Are they lower class citizens like Egyptologists describe them as? So we've got and we will look at some text coming up in just a second. So the various interpretations describe them as being mythical beings, followers of the god Seth, rebellious foreigners, people of the Delta, all of which have very, very few inscriptions. What about lower class citizens? Well, out of the 2,000 inscriptions that I looked at, not one actually describes them in which you can really say is 100% a social status as being lower class citizens. They were definitely Egyptian, and I will show you some inscriptions that really prove that. And I will also show you some inscriptions that give you an idea of who they were and what they did. Here we have two of the rekhyt people represented in this relief from a tomb. They don't have their crests, but this is the vignette of the Book of the Dead, and in the text it actually describes them as being the rekhyt people. So it's, you know, and I will show you another one of it coming up in which they do have the crest from the same scene. So what do the texts tell us? Well, 27 of the ones that I looked at show that they're under the protection of either the pharaoh or the Egyptian gods. So the first one here, Amun has chosen Hachipset to guard Egypt and to protect the Pat people and the rekhyt people. Now, if these are rebellious foreigners or people that could do harm, why would you have both the pharaoh and the deities protecting them? Or in the negative confession here on a stela dating to the 25th dynasty, around about 700 BC, it says, I did not rob from the rekhyt people. Why would it matter if you rob from the rekhyt people, if there are these potentially dangerous people? It seems for the Egyptians that this was not something that you should do. We have them being created by the gods, 35 texts. So here's just two examples. The first one, in order to provide for the kettle that he, Amun-Re, that's the god, created, the rekhyt people who came forth from his eye. Or down at the bottom, the maker of the sky, who bore the gods, the maker of the land, the creator of the rekhyt people. So they play a very common role in the creation in which the gods do create the rekhyt people for Egypt. They're commonly granted life. Again, this is not something that you want to do for your enemies, for foreigners who may potentially be enemies that could come into Egypt and potentially do harm. So 192 texts out of 2,000, roughly 10%, describe the rekhyt people as receiving life. So just to give you two examples here, when Amun-Re rises, the rekhyt people live. Their hearts live when they see him. Amun-Re, who's a form of the sun god, here he is rising in the horizon. Or Libet, this is an inscription describing the pharaoh, Libet, in order to cause the Pat people and the rekhyt people to live. So that's why the king is making an offering to the gods, so that both the Pat people and the rekhyt people live. But the most common texts, aside from titles, and titles are excluded from my study because they don't give us too much of an indication as to who the rekhyt people were. It might be, for example, you have the title Medu Rekhyt, which is translated as the staff of the rekhyt people, or the controller, someone who looked after the people, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about them. So excluding titles, the most common type of text that you find is ones describing the rekhyt people performing a series of actions, emotions, and gestures. 368 texts, but some of these texts contain multiple terms describing the rekhyt people doing things. And it's really summed up very well in this text that we have from Philae, dating to the Roman period. And it says, you, i.e. Horus, the king of the gods, become the Pat people and the rekhyt people, and all that they make with their hands. So it's specifically saying that this is an action. This is what the rekhyt people are doing with their hands. And as we can see from the lapwing itself here, it's got the arms raised in adoration. Very common in Egyptian art. So to sum all that up in terms of who the breakdown of who the rekhyt people might be, this is what we have. We have those that identify the king or the gods creating the rekhyt people, those that relate to live. As you can see, the greatest percentage here is titles over here, which are excluded. But then next, other than the unknown ones, where we might just have the word, but it's isolated and doesn't give us anything else, we have those that relate to the worship. The positive ones that we're dealing with. So whether that's performing various actions, emotions, and gestures. So the negative ones are very little. There's not much that we have. This is the negative ones. But in general, if we add those that relate to the pharaoh, or to the rekhyt people living, the positive ones down here, being protected by the gods, etc., it's much greater than what you would perhaps expect. We can also look at the determinatives which are used in the writing of the word rekhyt to see how they should be interpreted to a certain extent. And I mentioned all the rekhyt people and what they do with their hands in the inscription just from a few slides ago. And here in this slide, you can see a variety of actions that are performed. The earliest form of the rekhyt that you find in inscriptions is just a lapwing standing. No human arms. They aren't introduced until the 12th dynasty. But as we move further into the New Kingdom, you see more and more determinatives which are used. Not just hands raised in adoration, but you can see this one is doing a little jubilation, almost look like he's dancing here. This is the Henu gesture. And when we get into the Greco-Roman period, you can have just the flail, which is used as a substitute for the rekhyt. You can see even the flail is used instead of wings directly behind the bird there. The term rekhyt, or at least the rekhyt people, continues right into the Roman period, as we've seen, but also in the Demotic and Coptic language to a certain extent. While the word rekhyt in Egyptian is used in the Knopos decree, we find na remechu, which is used in the Demotic. So it's clearly equating both the rekhyt people and the remech as being very similar to one another. And in chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, where you have a deity called Waj Rekhyt, the one who causes the rekhyt people to flourish. In one instance, you have the name which is translated, or which is written in Demotic, instead as the one who causes the remechu, the remech people, to be well. So you've got the substitution of the word. We can also have the rekhyt in hieroglyphs, but then the Demotic equivalent is Pamesha, which means the multitude. And as I said, it continues in both Demotic and Greek. What about the iconography? Well, we've already looked at the lapwing itself, which is used to identify the rekhyt people. But is that the only way that they can be shown? Well, not at all. In fact, there's three main forms that you find. Again, remember that we're dealing with a period of over 3,000 years of Egyptian history. We have the zoomorphic, which is the complete lapwing, such as the king has in his hands, in this relief from the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, representing the rekhyt people. We can have them anthropomorphic, which is completely in human form, or therioanthropic, which is a mixture of both lapwing and human features. So let's look at some of those. Well, for the zoomorphic ones, we've already seen the scorpion mace head. We've seen the statue base of Djoser. We have the marsh scenes, such as the one of Amenemhat, which I showed you earlier, but these are definitely not a representation of the rekhyt people. They're just there as birds within the marshes, at least the marsh scenes ones. And as you saw from the previous slide, you can have the child, you can have a pharaoh or a child deity holding a lapwing. And I'm currently finishing off an article on this, which will be published hopefully next year, which deals with around about 100 scenes of the pharaoh and the child deities holding lapwings in their hands. And although I have around about 100 of them, only one of them gives an actual inscription from Hibis Temple, where it says, "Your body is nourished by my milk." It's a suckling scene. "For Upper and Lower Egypt, and all of the rekhyt people are united for you in your grasp." And this is when the king is holding the lapwing while being suckled by the goddess Nate. What you find in these holding scenes is that it's usually the pharaoh receiving emblems of royal authority and kingship. And there's a clear association of the pharaoh being able to control the rekhyt people as being part of showing that he is capable, or she is capable, of ruling Egypt. So in this relief that we have from the Palace of Merenptah, which is now in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, you have the pharaoh Merenptah holding a lapwing in one hand while receiving the crook and flail from the god Atum Re on the right-hand side. What other anthropomorphic representations are there? Well, the earliest depictions of them in this form that can be positively identified as being the rekhyt people is this relief in the drawing on the right-hand side, which dates to the 5th dynasty. It shows 3 individuals who are pulling on a rope. We don't know what they're pulling, although we can guess from later scenes, which I'll show you in the coming slides. But directly above their heads, you can see the inscription which says, "All the rekhyt people." So it's identifying these 3 people as the rekhyt people. They're always shown bare-chested, wearing the shendit kilt, or the short kilt that you've got here. Their hairstyles can vary from short cropped hair, as we have here, shoulder length hair, or tripartite style wigs that you get in the later periods. Sometimes they can be shown with a goatee or even a curved beard, and even rarely with a broad collar. But all in all, from an iconographical perspective, they are depicted as Egyptians. There's no indication from the iconography that they represent foreigners from either Nubia, from the Near East, from Libya. They're depicted as Egyptians, 100%. Now, you saw them pulling on the rope in the previous slide, and here's 2 representations from the 18th dynasty in which they're associated with the rope. They're pulling on the rope down the bottom. The inscription that we have up here, although it's only partially preserved, we've got the lapwing at the top, coming down here. It says, "All the Pat people and the rekhyt people are pulling on the rope." And the rope is leading to the burial here of Amenemhat from the same tomb, TT 82, that I showed earlier. So they're taking part in the burial. And that's exactly that we have up the top. In this scene, even though you can't see the body being dragged, but the inscription directly above the heads of these figures identify them as all the Pat people and all the rekhyt people. They're not holding on the rope on this occasion. They've got their hands up in a type of praise or jubilation here at this time. The scene at the top, by the way, is the famous tomb of Rekhmire, Theban tomb 100 on the west bank of Luxor, where many of you have no doubt visited before and perhaps never spotted the rekhyt people before. It doesn't have the lapwing, but it's got the phonetic symbols spelling out the word all the rekhyt people. And I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with this scene that we have in the tomb of Ramesses, one of the most famous tombs on the west bank of Luxor, where we've got another funeral procession. But did you know that the rekhyt people are represented in this scene? It's actually very difficult to spot them. Let's see if up here, these individuals that are shown are the Pat people in front and the rekhyt people directly behind. And here's the fantastic publication by Davis from the 1940s, in which you can clearly see from the inscription, there's the little lapwing, that this is all the Pat people and the rekhyt people. You can see them represented on a variety of other reliefs performing various gestures, such as, again, if you look at this scene, you may be looking, where are the rekhyt people here? Well, just up in the top right-hand corner, we've got these two people who are kneeling in jubilation, and it says, jubilation by the rekhyt people, as this is part of the said festival of Azara II, dating to around about 900 BC. This is one of the most extraordinary reliefs that you'll find of the rekhyt people. It dating to the reign of Augustus, and it can be found on the birthhouse on Philae. It's a double scene. So what you've got here is the pharaoh Augustus, who is opening the shrine in order to take out the statue of the child deity Harperchered, who is being suckled by his mother Isis. And in the second part of the scene, the pharaoh is holding the statue of the god Harperchered in front of these three people, who are kneeling in jubilation, and as you can see from the inscriptions directly in front of them, this is the rekhyt people. So the statue of the god is being presented to the rekhyt people. And we're fortunate that the inscription behind it even gives us a little bit of context. It says recitation, be silent 4 times, be jubilant 4 times. And that probably means that the statue would have been lifted up towards the 4 cardinal points, to the north, the south, and the east, and the west, while all the people in front would have been in jubilation, would have been silent, perhaps as the king said a few words, and then would no doubt be then cheering. And it says, all the rekhyt people come in order that they may jubilate when they see the son of Azara, for he is the ruler. He is their ruler. So it's describing Harperchered as the ruler of the rekhyt people. And in the red chapel of Hachipset that I showed you earlier, this very well-known monument in Karnak, in the inside, in the Holy of Holies, there's a scene in which you've got a procession of a variety of individuals. Up at the top here, we have the god's wife of the moon, the most important female religious title at this time. Directly behind her, you have these 3 individuals who are identified by the title God's Father. Down at the bottom, we have someone who's described as being a male attendant. We have 2 female attendants. And then the inscription here for this individual, perhaps, identifies them, or it could be collectively that it's identifying all of these people, since it's not above the head, but in the middle, it says all the rekhyt people. And they're actually taking part in a festival which is taking place within the temple, which I'll come on to in a few slides' time. We have the inscriptions that go with it. You can see just over here, in which it's talking about them performing a hekanu gesture towards the gods. And then there's the theorio-anthropic form. This is the most common type that you find, in which you have the lapwing, usually a lapwing with human hands raised in either adoration or in jubilation. But in some cases, you can even have the human body with the head of a lapwing, which is exactly what we have in this representation on the right-hand side, which comes from the upper tier of Hachipset's temple at Daryl, Bahri, dating to around about 1450 BC. And in fact, Hachipset, during her reign, you have more rekhyts than I would probably say any others in terms of the amount of time that she stayed on the throne. And that's all quite interesting. But usually when they're in this form, you have the wings, which are pinned behind their backs, and when they are shown, which people see as being an act of subjugation. Earlier than that, though, we have the 12th dynasty lintel of Amenemhat, which you can see here, in which you've got the pharaoh celebrating his said festival. He's represented back to back in these 2 scenes, wearing the white crown and the red crown, the 2 crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. And directly below him, you've got these 9 birds with their arms in the the gesture, the Henu gesture of praise. And that's a gesture that you find throughout Egyptian history from this point onwards for the rekhyt people, such as this relief dating to the reign of Ptolemy the 9th, I think it is, or 10th, in which you've got the rekhyt people kneeling here in jubilation. We've got the inscription directly above. You can just see the lapwing which is being used there, but note the distinctive lapwing's crest that they have on their head. Above them you have the Pat people, and below them you have the Hen Mehmet. And this is another quite extraordinary relief dating to the Roman period that we have on the island of Philae. You've got these three people kneeling in the Henu gesture in front of two deities. These are the two gods associated with this particular area of Philae. Now you can see from the first figure that we have an unidentified king. This is the cartouche, where the name of the king would usually be located within. So you've got the king who is kneeling before these two deities while he's accompanied by two figures who are identified as the rekhyt people. You can clearly see from their hieroglyph as well as their crests, which stick a little bit upwards rather than behind. And sometimes you have to look very hard in order to spot them. You may be looking at this scene and thinking, well, where are the rekhyt people? You've got the pharaoh and his wife who are coming along. This is the entrance. This is the pylon that we have at Edfu Temple. You've got the king and his wife coming along, presenting offerings to the god Horus and Hathor directly behind him. But if you look very closely at the scene, just here, directly in front of them, these three little figures have been added. Now, although there's no text that goes with them, we can't say 100% that these are the rekhyt people. They do have the distinctive crest. But, as you'll see from a little bit later, the crest alone is not enough to 100% say that we're dealing with the rekhyt people here. They're actually on both sides of the doorway, so the next time you go to Edfu, do have a look out for them. They're very easy to miss. And I mentioned this chapter, this vignette from the Book of the Dead, a little bit earlier, in which we had the two winged individuals without their crests. This time, here they are, lying flat out, prone, but they've got their distinctive crests. You can have them in the form of a frieze, like this, as the rekhyt rebus. But this is more than just a frieze, this one, which comes from the temple of Hathor at Dendera, because the inscription, number 15 here, that comes with it, tells us that the king and the queen are presenting offerings to the gods while they're followed by the rekhyt people, almost as if the rekhyt people are taking part in this ritual at the same time. And that's quite extraordinary. So what role did the rekhyt people have? Well, as you can see, there's a very high percentage of texts that describe them as performing a variety of actions, emotions, and gestures for the deities or for the king. And this certainly increases over time. And you can see this even with the determinative changing over time. It goes from just the lapwing standing to a lapwing with its wings pinned behind, and then in the New Kingdom to a lapwing with human hands. As I said, it's both directed towards the gods as well as the pharaoh. And I describe these as being actions of maintenance. What exactly do I mean by that? What are actions of maintenance? Well, it's all about the maintaining of order over chaos and maintaining the cosmos. You'll be very familiar with the upholding of Ma'at if you've done any Egyptology. A lot of the scenes in the temples are all very much geared around the grammar of the temple, ensuring that you have the continuation of the world. And the rekhyt people have a very fundamental role to play in this, in my opinion. Here we have the lapwing who adore the pharaoh, and the pharaoh in turn makes offerings to the gods. The gods then ensure that you have the continuation of the world, the cosmos, i.e. making sure that people live. If you take the rekhyt people out of that equation, these people who are adoring the pharaoh, you don't have a king anymore. You don't have a ruler, because they don't have any, whether you want to call them subjects, followers, whatever that might be. You can't have a king without a following. And if you don't have a king, you can't have the gods, because there's nobody to make the offerings to the gods. And that is the end of the cosmos for the ancient Egyptians. So I think the rekhyt people have a very fundamental role to play in Egyptian art, which and religion, which is why I see this as being actions of maintenance. They're performing their actions, emotions, and gestures. I think in my thesis, I looked at 46 different terms that were used to describe the rekhyt people, whether it's adoring, praising, jubilating, kissing the earth, praying, all these different terms before the pharaoh and the gods. So that's what I see as being actions of maintenance. It's very much a reciprocal arrangement, which is summed up very well in this text from a statue, in which the owner is described as being one who satisfies the gods for his majesty, i.e. he's playing the role of the king and satisfying the gods, and one who satisfies his majesty for the rekhyt people, in which he's playing the role of the rekhyt people in satisfying the king. And that really sums it up very well, this actions of maintenance, this continual circle where you need all of these to be present in order for the continuation of the cosmos. And as we're approaching 7 o'clock, we will take a 5-minute break here, and then we'll look at the Temple of the Cosmos as cosmos, and to see the various areas where the rekhyt people may have had access to. So what I'll do for the chat is I'm going to turn it on for all panelists and attendees.
Thank you, Ken.
So if anyone wants to make any comments, I did see that the chat was going a lot. Hopefully everyone is okay.
Just a few more questions for you, nothing to panic about. So it's just turned 7 o'clock, so we'll be starting back at 5 minutes past.
Yep.
We won't be asking Ken any of the questions yet. We'll save them to the very end. So do grab yourselves a cup.
Yeah, we'll keep the questions till the end. And if you do have any questions, of course, it's much easier to post them into the Q&A button rather than the chat. Otherwise, they might get lost.
There's going to be quite a lot of questions for you, Ken.
Well, hopefully I answer some of them.
I think some of them you're starting to cover already. But is everybody enjoying so far? You can let us know in the chat if you're enjoying. I don't think you've scared anyone off yet, Ken. Thanks, Galina. Thanks, Terry. Good to know we've got some people enjoying it. So somebody's asked, when will the link for the lecture recording be available? It normally within 24 hours you'll have received an email, and that will give you a link to watch the recording again. It normally takes me that long because it takes a while to process and format on my computer. But I will start it going tonight, so it should be with you within 24 hours.
I did warn you that this was going to be a long one as well. I was hoping to get a little bit further than what I am now. I'm probably about 20 minutes behind or so.
That's better than I thought it would be, to be honest.
Maybe longer, maybe even be half an hour. There's still quite a lot to go, put it that way. It's
absolutely fascinating, though. It's really, really interesting. It's been a little while since I've read the book, so it's good to have a refresher. And Ken's right, once you've seen these, you will see them everywhere you go. You will never get away from them now.
They are there. They are everywhere.
We'll have to set you up a hashtag, Ken, so people can tag you on social media whenever they find one. Ellen asks, Ken, when are we going to Egypt? When are you doing your Rekhyt tour?
Well, when I started doing tours back in what 2002 or 3, we actually started running them. Well, shortly after that, as journeys of the rekhyt people, which is what we called the tours. So maybe we need to resurrect journeys of the rekhyt people again and do some tours to Egypt.
I would say an Egyptian stela for everyone we spot, but I think we'd be quite tipsy by the end of it.
And I see there's quite a lot of questions in the Q&A.
And lots of lovely compliments on the talk as well, Ken. So I'll make sure you have a look at the chat at the end if you haven't had a chance to see them all.
Yep. I'm glad everyone's enjoying it. Hopefully it's worth the wait.
It's only been 8 months you've been promising this talk, Ken, not long. You're obviously being kept too busy at the Egypt Centre.
There's a lot going on.
All good.
All good, absolutely, yeah.
So I know we're not doing questions yet, Ken, but a few people have asked if you could clarify the difference between the Pat people and the Rekhyt people.
Yeah.
But you will,
I wish I knew the answer for that, and that's the big problem, because people usually do put this whole idea that the Pat people are the elite, the upper class of Egypt, because you have the title Iri Pat, that's often described as being the leader of the Pat people, which you have some often seen as being a princely title, whereas you have them as the elite, and then you have the rekhyt people as lower class citizens. And while the Pat people may be identified as being the somewhat upper class, again, as I said, there's no real inscription that specifically sets out any kind of social difference between them. And we may be putting our own Western perspective on things. And that's the big problem that we've probably got here. We need to be very careful not to put our own Western perspective and see this as being different social classes. What I will point out is that the rekhyt people are much more common in both iconography as well as texts, and that includes within the temple. So, for example, you only ever find, at least as far as I'm aware, you only ever find representations of the Pat people if you have the rekhyt people present. Whereas you have the rekhyt people who can be depicted alone without the Pat people. Now, surely if the Pat people were the elite, you would expect to find them a lot more. Certainly within the temples or in reliefs such as that I showed you earlier with the Sed festival, etc. And you don't get that. So it's not so straightforward. And the Henmemet people, that's another even stranger group. People often describe them as being the sun folk. What does that mean, to be the sun folk? It doesn't make much sense. So people have described them as being priests. We actually don't have an answer, a proper answer as to who they could potentially be. Yes, there's suggestions, but I think there's still a need of a greater study on both the Pat people and the Henmemet people. And it could be, certainly what I think for the rekhyt people, is that their identity changes over time. It doesn't always stay the same. And you may have had that for both the Pat people and the Henmemet people, if that makes sense.
Thank you for clarifying, Ken. The only other question I was going to quickly ask you now is, just before the break, you showed a reciprocal statement with a statue. Whose statue was that, please?
I'll have to look it up and see whose that is. But whoever asked that question, I can't remember where it was. If you send me an email, I can tell you where the citation is from.
Thank you. And another quick question that isn't a proper question on the topic is your MA thesis available online? I know you're going to do a little plug for your
MA
book at the
thesis
end.
is available online. It's on my academia page, I believe. If not, I can certainly email it to anybody who asks. It was published in the Current Research in Egyptology, 2007, 2006 it must have been. I'm pretty sure it's on my academia page.
I'll have a quick look once you start talking and see if I can find it, and I'll share it in the chat if you don't mind, if I can.
Yep.
No problem.
So looking at the temple as the cosmos, and I mentioned earlier that this whole cosmos aspect is very important for both Egyptian religion and iconography. You see it throughout the temple. Those of you that have done any Egyptology will be very familiar with this, that the temple is a representation of the world, with the stars in the sky painted on the ceiling, and the plant motifs that you'll find on the bases of columns along the edges, the lower parts of walls. And as you get further into the main Holy of Holies, it becomes more condensed. So you've got this wide open space as you first go into the temple, often open to the sun. And when you get into the Holy of Holies, it becomes dark, where there's limited space available for activities, shall we say, without getting into too much detail there and putting any words in your mouth, as you'll see in just a second. So the parts of temples that really need to be looked at in terms of trying to look at access to the areas include temple exteriors, doorways, courtyards, hypostyle halls, inner sanctuaries, and chapels. Did the rekhyt people have access to these areas? And if so, what evidence do we have for them being accessible? And this is where I'm going to going to launch a poll, hopefully. Only it's not actually showing. Oh wait, what's happened there? Maybe I'm not going to launch a poll because
I don't have an option on my screen, Ken, which normally I can see when you've got one.
It doesn't say add questions. I did create them. Let me stop sharing the screen. Maybe I didn't hit the save button just to see whether it's showing in my Zoom. That's going to be unfortunate if it's not working. 1 second. I wanted to ask you, which areas of the temple do you think would have been accessible to the rekhyt people? And it doesn't seem as if it's going to allow me to do that. So we're going to have to skip the poll for some odd reason since it's not there. That's a shame.
Would you like people to answer in the chat, Ken, and I can let you know the general consensus?
No, don't worry about it. That's fine.
Okay.
So let's move on really and start looking from the exterior to the interior as to the various places that may have been accessible. I assume my slide is back on now, by the way. Can you see my slide?
We can see you, yeah.
Okay, so looking at the exteriors of the temples, these were certainly accessible at times, and you often find pilgrims' grooves, as they're commonly called, on the exterior walls. So here's just two examples that we have from Medina Tabu. Now, a lot of people will say that these are very much a modern feature that is found in Islamic times and even still up in today, where people would go there and scrape a handful of dust, which they believed had magical connotations associated with it. And certainly we do know that this took place and still seemingly does into modern times. Excavations that have been conducted at site in the Delta by Penny Wilson have actually shown that this practice was commonplace during the 18th dynasty. So it's not primarily a new phenomenon. It did go back into pharaonic times. And that could perhaps, in some cases, give us an indication as to the areas that would have been accessible to people other than the priests. We can look at graffiti, where they're located, both in hieroglyph, Demotic, hieratic, Coptic, whatever it might be. And a study that was done by Claude Tronacker at Karnak showed that a lot of the times it was done by the lesser priests, such as the Wab priests or the scribes, not the high-ranking priests. but it gives us an indication as to the areas that they would have had access to. Just keep in mind, of course, that we're dealing with priests, or at least the literate in this case, who are some of the elite. There's the Contra Temples that you find at the very back, mainly, of temples. So, for example, at the Temple of Hathor at Dendra, right at the very back, you have this huge emblem of the goddess Hathor. And this is likely to be a Contra Temple, which would have been located directly at the back of the sanctuary. And they're common during the Greco-Roman period, such as at Dendra, Shanhur, Daryl, Medina, Dershilwit, Karnak, Kamumbo, Kalapshadush, Dachau, just to give you the name of some of them. We know that some of these were referred to as being places of the hearing ear, such as the Eastern Temple at Karnak, indicating that you would go there in order to have your prayers heard. So this is a reconstruction of the one that you have at the very back of the Khonsu Temple at Karnak. And it has recently been reconstructed. The last time I was in Egypt, just over a year ago, I was able to go there, and they have now reconstructed this feature that you have at the back of the temple, which is fantastic. You can have veiled images, usually on the outskirts of walls, the exterior walls. Those of you that did my Valley of the Kings course will be familiar with these, in which you have scenes of the king before a variety of goddesses, in this case Bastet. But if you look very closely, you've got these little holes located around the figure, indicating that there would have been some kind of frame, a wooden frame likely, and that the image itself would have been veiled, covered over, so that people couldn't see it, presumably unless they, I don't know, paid some money or whatever they needed to do for the priest to give them access to this particular image. For the Egyptians, it was clearly something sacred. Doorways are important. You commonly find these so-called pure texts located on the door jambs, telling us that everyone who enters into the temple, or this part of the temple, should be pure 4 times, or that anyone who shall approach this statue in an impure state, i.e. that they shouldn't have access. So you've got restricted access to the temples. Not everyone could just walk in, go right to the back of the Holy of Holies, say a prayer to the gods, etc. There was levels of access. The stele that you have on the right-hand side, which is now in Berlin, is a fantastic one of Nebret, in which you've got this high official, Nebret, kneeling in adoration before the image of the god Amun, or Amun-Re. But note that this is a statue of the god which is in front of the pylon. You could even say that this is maybe a specific temple at Karnak, or a gateway at Karnak, which is being shown here. But Raphael Giveon wrote many years ago now that the common people, and the rekhyt people are usually seen as being the common people, as you know, were not allowed into the inner parts of the temple where the statue of the god was. Amun, in this case, has gone out of his way to listen to Nebret. So you've got the god almost emerging from the temple to the gateway so that Nebret can kneel in adoration. And certainly some inscriptions on these doorways indicate that they would have been accessible to common individuals, the non-priestly elite. So, for example, the Temple of Ramesses II on the eastern side of Karnak is described as the Temple of Ramesses, beloved of Amun who hears prayer, at the upper gate of the house of Amun. The fact that he's here hearing prayer indicates that it would have been accessible for people to come and to offer prayers. And note that this temple, it can be seen as a bit of a contra temple because it's not part of the main Amun temple, but it's in the opposite direction. You enter it from the eastern side rather than the western side of Karnak, which you have today. There's a lot of gods who hear prayers, such as Amun-Re, Ptah, Harwer, Hathor, Harun, Horamakhet, the list goes on. And you commonly find stelae such as this on the right-hand side, often referred to as being ear stelae because of the depictions of ears. The bigger the ears, or the more ears that are represented on the stela, or the better chance that the gods are going to be able to hear you. And in this case, we have praise to the Ka of Ptah that we've got mentioned here. You even have a god in the Greco-Roman period who's referred to as the hearing ear, Mr. Sejim, which is quite a nice god. And common epithets that are associated with these deities include hearer of prayer, hearer of the prayers of everyone, hearer of the prayers of gods and men, the gods who listen to supplicants, opener of ears, that's quite a good one, mighty of hearing. So all indicating that these are gods who are listening to the people. On the eastern wall, exterior wall of one of the rooms at Luxor Temple, you have a series of reliefs of a variety of deities, usually Amun. This is the image of Amun that you've got here in his ithyphallic form. But the inscription, very basic, which is right in front of us, tells us that we're dealing with Amun or Amun-Re, who listens to the prayers of the Yad, with this bird at the bottom, and that word can usually be read as the downtrodden. So here's the Amun-Re who's listening to the prayers of the downtrodden that you've got here, indicating areas that may have been accessible to them. Note also the post holes at the bottom of this one, where it would have also been a veiled image at some point. There's an excellent article on this by Peter Brand, which you can download for free online, in which he discusses this image as well as other veiled images of the deities. Doorways I mentioned earlier, but I'll come back to it. They're very important. We have these pure texts. We also know that at some periods of time, the doorways are referred to as the gate of rendering justice, seemingly indicating that court proceedings would have taken place at gateways. Or they can be described as being the place of hearing petitions of God, petitions of every petitioner. So you would go there if you had any petitions for the gods. And that brings us to the People's Gate, but I'm not going to look at it very much, because I'll be coming back to this when we come on to Luxor Temple in just a second. But this is the so-called People's Gate, as Lanny Bell referred to it in an article in initially in the 1980s. He called it the People's Gate because you have these representations of people who are kneeling in adoration just to the left-hand side of the doorway, which is just off to the right there. But note the lapwing hieroglyph in between. So this is all the rekhyt people who are kneeling in adoration at this doorway. And inscriptions do actually mention the rekhyt people at doorways. Here's two from the Ptolemaic period, both from Edfu. The first one describes the rekhyt people as being loyal to the king by kissing the ground at the portal. Sebhet is the word that's used here for the portal. Or in the second one, you've got the king who's caring for the Henmamet people, Pat people, and the rekhyt people who touch the ground at the portal of his house. So again, the portal is highlighted in this case. We have the term ruit, which is used for the portal. Moving further into the temple, we come to courtyards. Were courtyards accessible to people? Well, there seems little doubt that they were, at least at certain times during the year. And we know that hundreds of statues would often be placed within these courtyards so that petitioners could go there in order to ask various questions from the people who were represented by the statues, such as this one on the right-hand side in Luxor Museum belonging to Amenhotep, son of Hapu, in which the inscription on this statue base says, "O you men of Karnak, who wish to see Amun, come to me, give me offerings, or say prayers to me, and I will pass them on to the god Amun." So this reciprocal arrangement, once again, where these statues act as intermediaries. In this case, it's the word remech, which is used for men, so not specifically the rekhyt people. But we do have the rekhyt people who are mentioned in inscriptions on statues such as this. So here's one example from the statue of Panahesi in the British Museum. Fantastic inscription. It says, "O my image," i.e. the statue, "may you endure for the sake of my name, the favourite of everyone, that the rekhyt people may stretch out their arms for you, bearing rich bouquets, and may there be given to you libations of and incense from the remainder of your Lord. And then my soul comes running, so that he may receive food offerings with you." So it's specifically requesting the rekhyt people to come into this courtyard, presumably where the statue would have been located. We don't know the original context, unfortunately, but likely Abydos because of the deities who are represented at the front. That it's specifically requesting them to come stretching out their arms, bringing bouquets and libations, etc. Quite fascinating. We have inscriptional evidence indicating that courtyards were accessible in the form of letters. I won't dwell on these for too long as we're running late, but Buti-Amun at the end of the 20th dynasty, he says that he stands in his forecourt, the forecourt of Amun, daily without becoming fatigued, praying in their names and saying, "Give him very many favors before the general, his lord." So it's talking about Buti-Amun. Now, keep in mind, Buti-Amun is a high official. He's not a lower class citizen, but he does have access to the courtyards here. How far he could go in, we don't really know. And even the names of these courtyards may indicate that they were accessible. They're referred to as weshet, broad court or hall is the most common term, or the festival court, indicating festival took place there. The court of appearances, where the deities would emerge to appear in front of the people. And the court of the multitude, this mesha, which I mentioned earlier. In fact, the trilingual stela that you commonly have, which are written in hieroglyphs, Demotic and Egyptian, they specifically say in them that they should be set up in the court of the multitude so that people can read them. Now, I mentioned the burning of the the red chapel block earlier, in which you had the rekhyt people who were present, and it's all part of the ritual burning of fans, which is shown in this scene, where we have the god's wife and the god's father. Here, holding these torches in the top image, while down the bottom they're holding these fans with enemies, and they're going to burn these fans on a fire in order to defeat, symbolically, the enemies of Egypt. And that's exactly what they're doing over here. You can just see the stick that she's holding down towards the flame. Unfortunately, the block is now missing. But the inscriptions that accompany the previous block that I showed you earlier say, "Going outside in order to bring," a little bit of a gap, "the furnace being prepared by all the rekhyt people." So you've got the rekhyt people in the temple preparing this furnace, and the next inscription says, "Going outside to the forecourt." So it specifically tells us where. "The making of a furnace with an enemy in the midst of the court, taking one stand behind the furnace in order to light the furnace." So they're clearly involved in this ritual within the courtyard. And since it dates to the reign of Hachipset, we know that the forecourt, this courtyard, would have been the one that was constructed by Thutmoses II. It's now gone today, at least the pylon itself, you can find in the Open Air Museum, but it was demolished during the reign of Amenhotep III, who rebuilt a new pylon, the third pylon. But this would have been the original court where this furnace was lit by the rekhyt people, indicating where they had access to. And other inscriptional evidence show that they had access to courts in the Weshet-Hebet, the festival court. This is one from Hachipset's temple at Daryl, Bahri. It says, "Making jubilation by all the rekhyt people. They give praise to the Lord of the gods. They acclaim Ma'at Kare, that's Hachipset, in the actions that make her divine, because of her greatness, of the marvels that happened to her. Well, earlier on in the inscription, they tell us that this has taken place in the festival court. It's part of her coronation. And Amenhotep II at Elephantine, he talks about building a festival court. He says he made for his father Khnum, who resides in Elephantine. He made a festival court in order that all the rekhyt people may see that which he makes for him, given life. So he's making this festival court, as he specifically says, for the rekhyt people to see, presumably the festivities that are happening within it. And I mentioned the trilingual stele earlier with the Weshet Mesha, the court of the multitude, which, interestingly, when you have these trilingual stele in which it talks about erecting them within these rooms, you have the Weshet Mesha in Egyptian, in the public part, in the Demotic, and in the Greek, it translates as the place of the full public. Again, clearly indicating accessibility. As we go further into temples, what about the hypostyle hall, such as the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak? Well, we actually do have an inscription there, which is the only one really found within the hypostyle hall, indicating that some kind of accessibility to the rekhyt people. It says, he has made as his monument for his father Amun-Re, Lord of the thrones of the two lands, the foremost in Karnak, the making for him of an august temple of fine white sandstone, a place of acclamation for the rekhyt people in the mighty name of his majesty. Does this specifically indicate that they had access to this room, or is it referring to the rekhyt rebus that we have represented over 1,000 times in this room? It's also important to note, though, that the hypostyle hall changed over time in terms of its construction. But as we get beyond the hypostyle hall, we move into the inner sanctuaries. Who had access to these rooms? Well, from the Egyptian texts, temple texts, papyri, etc., it's clear that these were restricted areas. And you can see this in the Book of the Temple, currently being edited by Joachim Quack. And it says, no man may ascend to it, which is the sanctuary, except the one who is the great priest, the Wab-A'a, and who is to perform the divine ritual. So you don't have the ordinary people who would have had access to the inner parts of the temple. It would have been just the priests. And as this text tells us, the high priest, in a way, the great priest, who is having access. On the outskirts of temples, you could have chapels. There's a good publication dealing with private religion in Egypt by Sadiq, in which he discusses some of these chapels at Kantir, Memphis, Giza, Abu Sir, Tel El Amarna, Daryl, Medina, Elephantine, etc. And some of them are referred to as places of supplication and of hearing petitions of gods and men, suggesting that these would have been places for the ordinary people. And if you look at Daryl, Medina, you've got a whole series of chapels. The workmen, you could describe them as being the ordinary people, the workers of Egypt, and clearly they had access to these shrines. But more importantly, from the point of view of the rekhyt, we have an inscription on the stele which dates to the reign of Seti I, in which it says, unfortunately a little bit fragmentary, it says, he has made as his monument for his father Harun, which is one of the names for the Sphinx. There's the Sphinx that we have here at Giza. Horus in the horizon, the making for him of, presumably a chapel, to be set apart, to be a place, a place of supplication for the rekhyt people. So it seems that perhaps you had this main chapel, main temple in front of the Sphinx, and maybe you had one that was set away from it. I'm not saying this specific one, it might have been further away. This chapel possibly doesn't exist anymore, but just to give you a general idea, that could be the main temple, and then a little one away for the rekhyt people. So it's a specific place seemingly set away for them. And if we look now at which areas they had access, or sorry, when they had access to, some of them I've already covered in the first part of the lecture, you'll see that this is commonly during festivals, such as the appearance of the god, beautiful festival of the valley, the Opet festival, the New Year's festival. Lots of inscriptions describe the Rekhyt people participating in these events. And that includes even the royal festivals, such as the appearance of the pharaoh, the coronation, and said festivals. So I'll just show you a few inscriptions from that. This is a great one from Dendera, which describes the New Year festival. Clearly a very festive time. It says, Dendera is in festival, the domain is in exaltation, the great place is in festival. All their inhabitants are in joy. Happiness circulates in their faces. The townsfolk of Dendera are in joy. The inhabitants of Edfu are in joy. Good goes around the front of the district of Dendera. Exactness, i.e. truth, justice, cosmic order, exists in Pei and Edfu. The Pat people are in praise. The Rekhyt people with bowed head. The Henmemet people are in festival. The singers of Dendera are flooded with lotus, as women who are beautiful of eyebrow and faces likewise. Weaning children are in festival. Children are in exaltation. Those on earth are drunk daily. When they see the powerful one, this is the goddess Hathor, resting in her shrine during the beautiful festival of seeing her father. The sky and the earth are united. The right eye and the left eye are united. At the beginning of the year, the first month of the Akhet, day 1. So you can see here, the whole of Egypt, the whole of Dendera is in festival, including weaning children. Seems very unlikely, but you get the idea from the Egyptian texts. And for the said festival, this is certainly my favorite inscription that we have from Egypt. I mentioned earlier, in which you only have the Pat people depicted if the Rekhyt people are present. And that's exactly that we have in this scene, where you've got the pharaoh being carried by the souls of Nekin and Pei as part of his said festival. You've got two triads of individuals who are groups, I should say, who are kneeling in jubilation. The three at the top are described in these columns of texts, very detailed, as the Rekhyt people, while you have a very short text for the Pat people. Does that give us any indication that maybe you could really interpret this as showing that the Rekhyt people are more important than the Pat people? But this is what the text says, and it's really fantastic, really emphasizing the importance of the actions that the Rekhyt people perform. It says, these Rekhyt people jubilate in front of their lord at the procession to Bekdet of Re, the name of the Temple of Edfu. Dancing, now count all the different actions that they're doing. They're already jubilating. Here they are dancing for their sovereign in front of the palace of the king as he has arrived at the mansion of the said festival, after going up to the throne at the front of Edfu before Bekdet, dappled of feathers, leaping for his majesty, acclaiming for his Ka, kicking out their legs in front of their lord, rejoicing at the great prince in front of his palace, exulting at the lord of his house, dancing for the ruler, revering his Uriris, making great his power in front of the land. Another action which is unfortunately missing, but we've got the little determinative showing that it's some kind of action, doing something to the king when he goes forth to the horizon of Re, before Bekdet Re, master of the gods. So I think what we've got, 10 different actions which are being performed here, from jubilating, from dancing, kicking out their leg, rejoicing, all describing the Rekhyt people during this festival. It's really fantastic. And the appearance that I showed you earlier from the birth house at Philae, in which you've got the appearance of the god emerging in front of these Rekhyt people. Won't dwell on that as I've already looked at it. And that brings us on to the Rekhyt rebus, and this is where I had initially planned on taking the break, but as we can see, we're about 35 minutes late. But I don't think there's actually as much in this part as there was. So apologies for overrunning. I'm sure some of you are probably hungry and want a drink. So the rekhyt rebus, what is it? Well, the rekhyt rebus is made up of a number of different hieroglyphs. The most important one is the lapwing, representing the rekhyt people. Underneath that, you have a basket, representing which has the symbolic, has the meaning of all. Sometimes you can have a star in front of it, which spells out the word adoration, dua. Now, the star isn't essential. You don't need it because you've already got the arms of the rekhyt bird raised in adoration instead. So it's just, you've got it there twice to some extent. And then we have the name of the pharaoh directly in front. So if you combine all of this together, as we have in the previous slide, it spells out all the rekhyt people adore Ramesses. So that's what a rebus is. And it's something that you find in Egyptian art a lot, especially when we get into the New Kingdom. And this is where I wanted to do a poll to see what you think the rekhyt rebus indicates. And perhaps
we did have some comments in the chat, Ken, that the poll came up before the lecture started.
Oh, okay.
It may be because we're in a webinar, but
okay,
just to
yeah,
let you know,
I've never done a poll in a webinar before. Huh. So I wonder where the results go then.
I can't see them.
And I can find them.
They're not on my screen, but maybe we'll have another break if you've got a few more slides to go through.
Well, do people want to break? If they want to break, then do post into the chat. We could take a quick break. Otherwise, I'm happy to carry on here. I'll probably get the poll results that'll come up afterwards. I don't know if anyone's posting, so I'll continue. So why is the rekhyt rebus depicted? It's been the subject of a discussion really since the early 1980s by people like Lanny Bell and others. So here's just a few quotes of what people have described the rekhyt rebus as indicating. Richard Wilkinson, in his complete Temples of Ancient Egypt, says that it indicates areas of public gathering or worship. And Peter Brand described those in the hypostyle hall as a visual sign to the public that they had access to this part of the temple and that the illiterate could easily be taught to recognize this design as a visual sign, meaning you may stand here. So wherever you see this rebus on the columns, you could go, you could stand, you could say prayers, whatever it might be. And this is primarily based on the work of Lanny Bell from the 1980s, and then in an excellent article he published in 1997. And it's this article that really got me on to the rekhyt people. He looked at Luxor Temple, and in particular, the courtyard built by Ramesses II, which is described as being a place of supplication, a court of appearance, as well as a festival court. But what else have we got there? Well, this is the inscription calling it a place of supplication and of hearing petitions of gods and men, directly above there. Well, in this courtyard, we have the columns on the eastern side, which are decorated with the rekhyt rebus, mostly with a star, some without, perhaps just a mistake by the craftsmen who were doing this. You can see the ones highlighted in red are the ones that are decorated with the rekhyt rebus. And if we look at each column, those that are decorated have 8 lapwings apiece, which are orientated to face towards the center of the court, except for this one, which is a little off. Perhaps again, a mistake there by the artists. And because of that, Lanny Bell proposed that this courtyard at Luxor Temple would have been used by the ordinary people, the rekhyt people, during certain festivals, and that they had to stand over on the eastern side because that's exactly where the rekhyt rebus is depicted. So in this drawing that you have here, you've got the bark containing the statue of the god being brought out in procession. You've got the various dignitaries over on this side, whereas you've got all of the ordinary people of Egypt who are restricted to this side, which is where the rekhyt rebus is located. So what other evidence do we have indicating that ordinary people had access to this courtyard? Well, we've got the two giant cast statues of Ramesses II. Lanny Bell describes these as accessible to the ordinary people, and that they made the suppliants' pleas to the great hidden God whose sanctuary lay beyond. We have the triple shrine, also described as being a place of supplication and of hearing petitions of gods and men. And another inscription, well, in fact, two inscriptions in both the chapels of Khonsu and Mut, describe the making of a monument for his father. The one in the Khonsu chapel says, Khonsu in Thebes, Neferhotep, the fashion of an image of electrum, glittering with every kind of real precious stone, in order to uplift his beauty to the rekhyt people when he was upon the three poles. In other words, the statue of the god Khonsu is carried by the priests before the rekhyt people. Very explicit, or before Mut in her chapel. Perhaps even there would have been one in the Amun chapel, but it's not preserved anymore. But within the Amun chapel, right at the very back, you have this false door. And it's flanked by these two Medu Shepsi staff. These staff indicate that you have the presence of the god Amun here. And so Bill Murnane described this as, like many humbler cult foci in other Egyptian temples, the false door made the gods accessible to the common man, who was not privileged to enter the temples, but had to make the petitions from the outside. So Bill Murnane is certainly proposing that this doorway, this false door, was accessible to the ordinary people who would go here, say a few prayers, and the god would be able to hear them. It's even been described by Murnane, actually, as being a kind of a telephone booth where you would be able to communicate with the gods. And then we come to the People's Gate that I mentioned earlier, right over in this doorway. The door jambs on the exterior and interior describe the name of the door as the Great Gateway of the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Uzurmatre Setepenre, that's Ramesses II, whom all the rekhyt people adore that they may live. More importantly is the representations that you have certainly on the left-hand side of the rekhyt people. The right side is probably the Pat people, but the inscription itself is very much destroyed today. But Lanny Bell was able to make out the inscription before it had disintegrated. So we've got this doorway, and that's why he's describing it as a people's gateway. Various scholars have written on this, including John Baines, who says that it's the innermost part to which the normal people were allowed to come. Or Lanny Bell, who says that this doorway was effectively the People's Gate, and through it select townsfolk and officials were admitted to stand in the eastern half of the courtyard in order to observe the stately Opet festival. El Razik says that the inscription suggests that the name of this door could be used by the king coming from his palace. So we've got the name of the court, the triple shrine inscriptions, the false door, the cast statues, the rekhyt rebus, and the People's Gate, all seemingly indicating that this courtyard was accessible to ordinary people. Or does it? Well, actually, I have no doubt that the ordinary people had access to this courtyard. What I have problems with is interpreting the evidence to say that wherever you find the rekhyt rebus indicates areas of accessibility. Lanny Bell's article is fantastic and fits very well with Luxor Temple. But when you start to look at the rekhyt rebus in other places, in other temples, you find out that it's not quite true. And it's important to really look at the evidence in order to come to a conclusion. So for one of the chapters of my thesis, I examined different areas: the courtyards, the hypostyle halls, and the inner sanctuaries. Most Egyptologists would probably say that the courtyards were accessible. I would imagine very few would say that the hypostyle halls were accessible. And I don't think you would find really any Egyptologists who would say that the inner sanctuaries would have been accessible to the ordinary people, including the rekhyt people, if that's, of course, who they were. So for my thesis, I gathered together all the examples I could find of the rekhyt rebus on columns from the reign of Hachipset right through into the Roman period with Antoninus Pius. So it really spanned 1,500 years of Egyptian history. I'm not going to show you every example here, we just don't have time, but I will highlight a few, such as the Temple of Hachipset at Daryl, Bahri. This is the first time you have the rekhyt people represented on columns. On the upper tier of Hachipset at Daryl, Bahri, in the area which is referred to as the festival court. So it seems to have been accessible. And the columns that you see highlighted here are the ones that seem to have been decorated with the rekhyt rebus, although the court itself is very much damaged and has been heavily reconstructed. And one of the columns over here has this representation of a lapwing kneeling on a neb basket with the hieroglyphs underneath it, just partially preserved, which say Ankh-Sen. So you can reconstruct the text there, the rebus there, as all the rekhyt people adore in order that they may live. That's why they're doing their adoration here. And from the same courtyard I mentioned earlier, the inscription from Hachipset talking about her coronation taking place in this festival court with the rekhyt people who are making jubilation and giving praise and acclaiming Hachipset. But then if we look at the Temple of Seti I at Gurna, you can see we've got lots of columns here, both round as well as the square pillars. And the areas that you would expect the rekhyt people to have access to, certainly out here. You may even say, well, I wonder, could they have access to this area? But this depiction that you have on the column is actually coming from the Holy of Holies, right at the very back, in an area where there's absolutely no doubt the rekhyt people wouldn't have had access to. Even more so, if you look very closely, you have just the remains of a false door. And on the sides of the false door, you've just got the basket there. You've got another block that comes with it, but you did have lapwings in the form of a rebus flanking this doorway so that the king would emerge from his tomb in the Valley of the Kings to receive offerings within this room. So again, an area that you wouldn't expect the rekhyt people to have access. With the hypostyle hall that I mentioned earlier in Karnak, you've got 134 columns. 122 of them are decorated with a rekhyt rebus, 8 times each. So you can do some calculations to find out 8 times 122 as to how many rekhyt you have in this one room alone. But does that indicate that they had access to this room, this hypostyle hall? And yes, I mentioned the inscription earlier that is found up on this lintel describing Ramesses making an august temple of fine white sandstone, a place where the rekhyt people to extol the name of His Majesty. Does this physically mean that it was a place they had access to, or is it referring to the rebuses that you find on the columns? But keep in mind, this hypostyle hall that we see it today was at one stage a courtyard. So it wasn't always a hypostyle hall. What about the Temple of Seti I at Abydos? A place many of you will know well. You can see there's lots of columns in this hallway, or this temple. The first hypostyle hall, maybe you could argue, was accessible, and it does have the rekhyt rebus, carved in sunk relief by Ramesses II, including these very weird, almost double-headed looking ones that you've got there, which are usually interpreted as being a mistake. And yes, while they are a mistake, there's a lot more to it than just that, and I'll come on to that at the very end. The second hypostyle hall, all of the columns are decorated with the rekhyt rebus during the reign of Seti I, in high quality sunk raised relief. And they're all orientated so that they flank the 7 sanctuaries. The temple itself was very unusual in that you have 7 accesses, 7 sanctuaries, rather than a single one. So they're orientated, 4 going clockwise, 4 going anti-clockwise, so that they're facing at these accesses. But what about further on in? Here we have the so-called Azara Suite. This is certainly an area where the ordinary people wouldn't have had access to. Yet all of the columns there are decorated with the rekhyt rebus, and again, they're orientated to flank the center of the room, whether it's towards this sanctuary here or the other one, it doesn't particularly matter. They're all facing towards the center. Zooming further out of that temple, we've got another room over here, which is decorated with the rekhyt rebus, leading to the shrines of Nefertum and Sokar, facing towards the rear, the sanctuary. So certainly these areas at the very back, and I would say this one, undoubtedly wouldn't have been accessible. You could probably push for these areas to be accessible. I personally wouldn't. The Temple of Ramesses II at Abydos, just a kilometer away. Well, the outer courtyard is referred to as a rekhyt-people, a festival court, a place of prayer and of hearing petitions of gods and men. I've no doubt this would have been accessible during festivals. And you do have the rekhyt who are represented here in 3 different forms: as a complete human, as a human with the head of a lapwing, or a human with the lapwing's crest sticking out the back, but all identified by the hieroglyphs in front. All part of the rebus, all the rekhyt people adore in order that they may live, or are given life. That they live, yeah, sorry. What we also have in that courtyard is the Pat people, the Henmemet people, and the Remech. Very rare, actually, to find them in a temple of the New Kingdom. This is, I think, the only one I can think of offhand. Well, the Henmemet people we'll see in another place. So the courtyard would have been accessible, but what about the first Octa-style hall, as we're getting further into the temple? Well, all of the columns are decorated with the rekhyt rebus. All faces are decorated with this image, except for the central ones here. So 4 faces, 1, 2, 3, 4, which instead have this image down the bottom, representing all the gods who are in the sky and all the gods who are in the earth, almost like a representation of the cosmos. And we move into the second hypostyle hall, or Octa-style hall. This one, and that's where things get really confusing and interesting, because you have a whole host of beings that are represented. The rekhyt people, H stands for human, where they're shown as a human. You have the Pat people, the Remech people. You have the Henmemet people, the rekhyt with the head of a bird. I don't think we have any with a crest here, do we? We have this one, Irit. Irit Nebet, which means all eyes. In other words, everyone who has an eye is represented by this figure. But you also have other deities, such as the gods who are in the city, the gods of the sacred land, the gods of the necropolis, the gods of Rasatau, the westerners of the necropolis, the gods of Shitaid, etc. All in this hallway. Does this mean that they had access to this area? Again, I don't think so. And when we go further into the temple, right at the very back, you have these 2 rooms with 2 columns each, with the 9 niches for the Ennead of Edfu, of Abydos. You've got the 4 columns in the 2 columns of the 4 faces each, showing the lapwing, or the humans with lapwings heads here. So in areas that you wouldn't expect to find them. So to sum that up, where do we find the rekhyt rebus? Well, as I said, Lanny Bell's ideas for Luxor Temple fit very well, but when you look at it from a larger point of view, especially in the New Kingdom, what you find is that the areas that you would expect the ordinary people to have access to, the entrances and courtyards, just 6 occasions. Hypostyle Hall, 8. Inner Sanctuary, 7. So you actually find the rekhyt rebus more in the inner rooms of temples than you do find them in the areas which Egyptologists would describe as being accessible. And it's the same with the Greco-Roman period. Courtyards, we only have 4. The pronaos, the area between the courtyard and the hypostyle hall, 6. Hypostyle hall, 2. You may think here, well, we don't have any in the Holy of Holies. But the reason for this is Greco-Roman temple construction, you don't get columns within the Holy of Holies as you do in the New Kingdom. That's why you're not getting this. So this is only dealing with the columns. Friezes is another form of the rebus that you can get. So again, as early as the 18th dynasty, right through into the Roman period. The earliest one is in the Red Chapel of Hachipset. This is seen as being the Holy of Holies, this room here with the antechamber, you could say there. And you've got a frieze on one wall, lower down, which you've got these lapwings with their arms raised in adoration. Friezes are fairly common, and I'm only looking at them from in terms of temple architecture here, rather than in scenes within the temples. So you'll see a few coming up in just a second. Here's a few blocks which date to the reign of Nectanebo II, most likely, and you can see these very beautiful rekhyts, which are now on display in the Cairo Museum in the garden. When you get into the Greco-Roman period, you find that they look a little odd looking. They look more like dragons, I would say, in some cases, rather than just lapwings themselves. And it's actually these ones that first got me interested in, or first made me think about studying the rekhyt for my master's, because this is in the chapel, a sacred chapel, almost like a Holy of Holies, which is now reconstructed on Elephantine Island, but it's initially from Kalapsha. And the friezes on the lower edges of both walls depict these lapwings with their arms raised in adoration. And so it made me think about this idea that they indicated areas of accessible worship. And the more I looked at it, I found that you were finding them in areas that weren't usually accessible to the ordinary people, such as the Wabet at Dendra. Again, I don't think any Egyptologist would argue that ordinary people had access to the Wabet, one of the most important rooms from a religious perspective, ritual rooms within the temple during the Greco-Roman period. Yet if you look very closely on these screen walls, down at the bottom on each side, you've got 5 lapwings with their arms raised in adoration towards the center, and on the other side towards the center. And I should say, on the reverse of these walls, you have an additional 5 on each. As I mentioned, they do get a little weird looking when you get into the Greco-Roman period. These are ones that are coming from the Dakhla oasis that you've got there. They don't look like lapwings at all. They've completely lost their crest, but it's very clear that they are a representation of the rekhyt people, since we've got it on the other friezes, but they're not quite as nice. So looking at the distribution again, you're finding them in the inner sanctuaries more than what you're finding on the exterior parts. With doorways, I won't go into them too much since I've already kind of covered them, so I'll skip this slide. That's not too important, but looking at the doorways with friezes from the reign of Seti I right through to that of Antoninus Pius once again. So a very broad geographical as well as chronological data that you're getting from here. You have the names of doorways, such as at Luxor Temple. This is one from Buhen, in which it's described as being the great doorway of Menkaper, whom all the rekhyt people adore before Horus. Does that indicate that they had access to this doorway? Certainly what Egyptologists believe. But then we find these doorway inscriptions further on in temples, such as here at Gerf Hussein, the great doorway of Ramesses Meriamun in the house of Ptah, whom all the rekhyt people adore before Ptah, the beautiful of face. Further on in, just before the sanctuary, you've got these 2 pillars, which are decorated with friezes of these 4 figures who are kneeling in adoration. Now, fortunately, that block is now on display in Kalapsha, and there are just slight traces of hieroglyphs directly above, which I was able to make out, and it does actually say all the rekhyt people. So these are the rekhyt people represented in the room directly in front of the sanctuary. And flanking the sanctuary, you may be able to see just from this black and white photo, you've got 4 figures kneeling in adoration. Presumably you had the same on the other side, now destroyed. Unfortunately, I don't even know whether this doorway survived the building of the lake at Lake Nasser, so I've never been able to see this better photographs to see whether they even have the distinctive crest, or whether they have any inscription to say that this is the rekhyt people. But certainly you wouldn't expect them at the entrance to the Holy of Holies. And in Wadi al-Sabua, also in Nubia, you've got 3 doorways, each one moving in, which are flanked by 5 figures on each side, kneeling in adoration before the cartouche of the king. You've got traces of hieroglyphs directly above. We have an R, we have the H, you would have had the reed leaves here, which are now gone, and you have just traces of the lapwing there. Very hard to see. So we've got the lapwing people on this side, but interestingly enough, on the opposite side, it's not the lapwing people, the rekhyt people, despite the fact that they're shown these crests. Now, when it was published by a French Egyptologist some years ago, she did this drawing of it, in which she's depicted them with these Asiatic beards, and she describes these as being Asiatics. You can clearly see, though, that there's absolutely no beard for this figure. That's the figure there that is being drawn. They have the crest, yes, but the hieroglyphs, there's the male and female determinative that you have directly above. We have an M there. This is actually the Henmemet people. So on the right-hand side, you have the Henmemet people who are shown with the crests. So because of this, you can't actually say that anytime you see these figures with the crests, it indicates that you're dealing with the rekhyt people. Not always. And in Medinat Habu, right at the very top, you've probably all been there, at least many of you may not have seen these very rare representations of the king as a rekhyt person. There's, I think, 7 or 8 of them. There's the king. This is Ramesses III, kneeling in adoration. You've got the Dua hieroglyph in front. He's got the crest. And yes, while he's not identified as being the rekhyt people, what's interesting is that he's one of the few kings who has the title King of the rekhyt people, Nesu Rekhyt, whatever that implies. We've got some phrases. I know I'll go a little bit quicker since I'm sure some of you want to eat, but you've got phrases of lapwings down here, flanking the entrances to 2 doorways that we have in the Temple of Khonsu at Karnak, while the pillars on the outside all have lapwings. So lapwings on the columns and lapwings on the doorways. So distribution, once again, you find the doorways more in the inner sanctuaries than you do on the exterior. So to put that all together, you can see 30% of all of the rekhyt rebus on columns, doorways, and friezes are found within the Holy of Holies, areas that I think everyone would say are inaccessible. And if we want to add in the pronaos, the hypostyle hall into that, then you're dealing with 59%. Now keep in mind, of course, that 11% are undeterminative because they're just individual blocks. Only 30% are found in areas that people would usually say that were accessible. So this really indicates that the rekhyt rebus cannot be an indicator of accessible worship. But important to note is their orientation, flanking towards the central access. And this brings us back to the first courtyard, or the first hypostyle hall at Abydos of Seti I. Because you have these weird double-headed or double lapwings placed on top of one another. As I've said, it is a mistake by the artist, but it's a lot more than that. Looks like you've got one lapwing facing one direction, then the artist made a mistake and rotated it to the opposite direction. But then again, if you look very closely at all of the columns within this hall, you'll see that some have been recarved, even though they go in the same direction. If you look very closely, you've got the crest above. So why did they recarve it? Well, the answer to this is that it was initially carved by Seti I. In fact, the whole room was carved by Seti I in high quality raised relief, but Ramesses II, his son, came along and he usurped it. So what we actually have here is the original lapwing faced to the left, was carved by Seti I, and you've just got traces of a sun disk up here. You'll see it better in the next slide when I come on to. So it was initially facing this direction. Ramesses' men came along and recarved it facing this direction. But for some reason, an important reason, it was recarved with the bird facing the opposite direction, now facing towards the right. And that's quite fundamental in determining whether this rebus is just a filler, just a bit of decoration, as some people have described it as. Now, I mentioned the sun disk on top of the lapwing, or sorry, on top of the cartouche. This is how Seti carved his ones. Ramesses didn't add the sun disk on top of his name. So if we look very closely at this one, there's the sun disk inside. The cartouche, you've even got the line of it coming down here. And you've got the two lapwings, one on top of one another. So to show it better in this one, here you've got two in the opposite direction. You can clearly see them. This one with the sun disk. So that's what the original decoration looked like. Then you had the cartouche of Ramesses II going on top. So in some of the columns, Ramesses has changed the direction, and others he has kept the direction. What does that tell us? Well, it's actually quite simple, because when the temple was initially constructed, there were 7 entrances, as you can see down at the bottom. 7 entrances for the 7 sanctuaries. And so all the lapwings were orientated to flank these entrances. But when Ramesses comes along, he decides to close up the doorways. And he adds his great dedicatory inscription on this side. He may have blocked these ones as well at some point. Certainly that one is blocked today. And he changed the orientation of the rekhyts in the first courtyard, or the first hall. So instead, they all face towards the sanctuary. You can see the arrows that they've changed there, unlike the ones in the second hall, which he's kept exactly the same. So now that you've blocked up those entrances, you now need the rebuses, the rekhyt, to face the central access with the sanctuary of Amun that you have right at the very back. So to summarize very quickly, who were the rekhyt people? Were they the people of the Delta, the common people, subjects, or were they people of Seth, etc.? They may have been. They may have initially been the people of the Delta. They may be a social class, but it's really difficult to prove for sure. What I'd like to almost propose here, and I know that this has a lot of difficulty in terms of being able to say with any great certainty, is but certainly from an inscriptional point of view, you could really say that the rekhyt people are the worshippers par excellence, the laity perhaps. And this is not, I'm certainly not the first person to suggest this, because you already have Maspero back in the 1890s to do so. Are these the faithful, the followers, the so-called, if you want to call them cheerleaders, and I don't mean cheerleaders with pom-poms, etc., but the people who are believing in the Egyptian gods and the pharaoh as the leader, and that the rekhyt people are there to cheer on, to participate in these activities. Which areas were accessible? Well, certainly the courtyards and chapels were accessible in the exterior parts of the temple, but what about the inner parts? As I said, I don't think there's any evidence to indicate that they would have had access to the Holy of Holies. All the texts tell us that they didn't. But we do know that they participated in festivals of the gods, royal festivals, said festivals, etc. And who had access? It wasn't just the rekhyt people, clearly. It was the Pat people, Henmemet people, the priests, the scribes, all sorts who were often requested to come in order to give their petitions and to leave offerings to the statues. But importantly, what is the function of the rekhyt rebus? Is it an indicator of accessibility? If it is, we'd have to completely change our interpretation of ancient Egyptian religion and accessibility of temples. Because as I've shown you, you can find it in the Holy of Holies more than what you can find in the outer courtyards. So if we follow Lanny Bell's proposal, then it means that the rekhyt people had access to the sanctuaries. And I don't think any Egyptologist would really accept that. It's clearly not a filler, because you can see that the artists of Ramesses II have changed the rebus 3 times, changing the orientation so that it's facing the right way. And we even have a papyrus, which is now in Oxford, in which it describes the decoration of a temple, how the rebus has to be orientated to face the sanctuary during the Greco-Roman period. So it specifically says that. So my new interpretation, or my interpretation of it, would be that it's not a physical marker of the participation of the rekhyt people, that they are there in person, but it's more a symbolic greeting and worshipping of both the gods as well as the pharaoh who would emerge from the inner parts of the temple. And it's clearly linked to the temple access in terms of the orientation. And yes, of course, the rekhyt people did actively participate in festivals, but we also need to keep in mind that, again, we look at Egyptian art from a very static point of view, that it's just this scene carved onto the walls. For the ancient Egyptians, it's a lot different than that, as I'll come on to in the next slide or two. But it's all about the reciprocal arrangement, the upholding of ma'at, that you need the people there to make their offerings to the gods, to the pharaoh, who's represented through the cartouche, to ensure that you have the continuation of the world. And if we look at the Contra Temple, once again, we have the rebuses, which are in the courtyard. We have the doorways, which have the lapwings. Keep in mind that in Egyptian art, the Egyptians believed that hieroglyphs, depictions, were alive. They weren't static images. They weren't immobile images, but they were movable images. So as the god or the pharaoh emerges from his sanctuary, you've got these lapwings representing the rekhyt people who are perpetually adoring the god and the pharaoh, ensuring the continuation of the cosmos. So to finish off, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. It has been quite a long talk. I did promise it would be long. I didn't expect it to be as long as this. And of course, thank you to everybody who has helped me find rekhyts in the past. There's a few people in the great hypostyle hall over the years. Some people have asked about my book. I spoke to Wolfram Grajecki, who is the publisher, and he has said that if people want to order it, they can do it directly through him. And he will do a special offer at £55. It's usually £75. So £20 off it with free postage in the UK, or €10 for posting in the EU. But that's an offer which is only valid until next Sunday. So if you do want it, do email him and mention the lecture offer, so that he knows that it's not just a random person who is requesting the book. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it was worth the wait, because it has been a long wait for this talk.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was a very comprehensive overview. Absolutely fantastic.
I cut a lot out as well.
For you, that was very, very good, actually. I'm very impressed. Could you open up the chat again, please?
Oh, yes.
Start on the Q&A.
Yeah, the Q&A should be open, shouldn't it?
On the chat, and I'll start reading the Q&A.
Chat is now open.
Fantastic. We do have a lot of questions for you. I've managed to combine a couple.
I shall try and answer as much as I can.
Just shout that you've had enough. We've still got 130 people with us.
Good.
And a few have sent their apologies, and we'll be catching up on the recording.
Yeah, apologies to everybody for going long.
But honestly, for Ken talking about the rekhyt, this is pretty good. So So the first question is about the lapwing birds.
Yeah.
They're specifically found in marshy areas such as the Delta.
Yep.
Is there any significance in this? And could you elaborate on why the form of a lapwing was chosen, please?
We don't know. We don't know why the lapwing was specifically chosen. There has been a few suggestions before. As I say, I know very little about birds, so I'm just kind of going from what people who do know about birds have told me. But apparently they're quite noisy birds. They make a lot of noise. So a few things that I've read before is that because, of course, when you've got a group of people together, as they're all talking to each other, they make a lot of commotion and noise, perhaps similar to what lapwings would have done. And this may be why the lapwing was chosen, to represent a group of people. Possibly. We may never know for sure, because I doubt the Egyptians would have written this down for us. And yes, they are very closely associated with marshy areas in the Delta, and that's certainly where we would expect to find them today. How it would have been in pharaonic times, possibly a little bit different, but you certainly would have expected a lot in the Delta, and that may even be why the lapwing was associated with initially the people in the north, as we have in the scorpion mace head.
And then a couple of questions I've combined about you showed the rekhyt birds hanging from staffs.
Yep.
What did the symbols above the staffs mean? Did they provide information as to why they were hanging like that? And
they're gnome standards that you have there, and you commonly find these standards being carried in the early dynastic period, such as on the scorpion mace head. You see the same standards which are being carried in procession, only you don't have people hanging from the nooses.
You've beat me to the second part, because it asked, is that similar to the ones hanging on the scorpion mace head for gnome standards? So you've covered that.
Yeah. And you see that right through into the Roman period, where you've got these standards being carried by people.
Then the next question is from Sue about, you mentioned the lapwing being carried by children in a number of images. Are the birds always held by the wings? And then a question about, were the wings entwined to prevent the birds from flying away? And does this mean that the people are bound or oppressed?
Right. Okay. So the first question on holding the lapwing, child deities and the king as a child will commonly hold the lapwings, but it's actually quite rare to see non-royal and non-deities holding lapwings. There are 3 representations in the Old Kingdom in which you've got children who are holding birds, but it's primarily the hoopoe which you will see see being held by children. And that's, I think, quite important. Perhaps it even indicates that maybe the lapwing couldn't really be held by non-royal individuals, royal/divine individuals, because of the association that you've got there with kingship. So it's just these 3 scenes that I'm aware of in the Old Kingdom. It's not always by the wings. Sometimes, in fact, the earliest representations of the king in the 18th dynasty holding them, they're holding them almost like by little straps that they hold them by, almost like an ankh. They're holding like the top of an ankh, and you've got the lapwing underneath it, which is resting on a little neb basket. Is that all of them there?
The next question is, you mentioned in your research the different inscriptions you looked at that mention the rekhyt. Why didn't you use the titles? Would they not have given clues as to the structure of social aspects of a subculture, perhaps?
No, because a lot of, some of the titles are actually quite useful, yes, but a lot of the time, so for example, I think one of the titles that you have is Nebti Rekhyt, which means the queen of the Rekhyt people, and it's usually held by goddesses such as Hathor, Isis, etc. And I think that occurs around about 700 times, mainly in the Greco-Roman period. But it doesn't actually tell us anything about the Rekhyt people. There are some in which they occur 2 or 3 times, such as you have an official who is described as being the master, the largest of the Rekhyt people. That occurs, and sometimes they can give us little bits. And I did mention them in my study, but I didn't look at them from a greater point of view, because they don't tell us too much about who the Rekhyt people were.
Thank you. And Val asks, you showed an image with 9 lapwings.
Yep.
Do you think that correlates or contrasts with the 9 bows representing the enemies of Egypt?
Very good question. And one of the sections in my book actually does include the nine bows, because there's a clear association to a certain extent with the 9 bows, both inscriptions as well as in the representations. 9 is certainly a common number that you find with the lapwings, but also keep in mind that 9 is a common number that you find with the Ennead, with a group of gods. So 9 doesn't necessarily always mean bad or enemies, such as the 9 bows.
Interesting question from Karen. Are there any mummified lapwings?
Not that I'm aware of. That's a good question. We need to ask Salima that to find out. That's a good question.
A question about, would the term for rekhyt tie in with any of the original tribes that made up Egypt, i.e. the Pat people being one tribe?
That's a good question, and certainly early Egyptologists 100 years ago or so used to refer to these as being almost like totems, that they did represent the tribes, the Lapwing tribe and so on. It could be. Our big problem that we're then going to get is this is probably going to be before the unification of Egypt, which is then going to be before we have the advent of writing. And so certainly by the time we get into the Old Kingdom, when we start to really get inscriptions mentioning the rekhyt people, their meaning has probably evolved and changed.
You mentioned an article by Bells.
Yeah.
I didn't catch the name of it. Would you be able to share a link for that one?
I'm not sure if it's online or not, but if anyone wants it, if you email me, I can send you a PDF of it.
Thank you.
Excellent article.
Is there any evidence of what happened to the rekhyt people during the Amarna period? Are they mentioned at all at that point?
Yes, they are, and they still appear. What I should have put in here is a scene from the Window of Appearances, which are very common during the Amarna period, and you do actually have the rekhyt people on either side. What I also showed, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I'll then be able to go back to an image that I did show, but I didn't give it any context. But I showed a stela, and it dates to the Amarna period, and it's now in the Petrie Museum. There it is. So I'll put up this was found at Amarna. Right, where? So here's a stela in which you've got Azara in here, which is interesting, of course, from the whole Amarna perspective. But you've got 3 lapwings underneath it. Oh, we've lost it now, have we? But you may have seen it. That stela is in the Petrie Museum, and that was found at Amarna.
A question on if there's a difference in the types of temples and the presence of accessibility.
There is a big difference, because you have the state temples such as Karnak, Luxor Temple, etc., and then you would have the mortuary temples on the West Bank. I would probably say that the people would have had more access to the state temples, at least to the courtyards, than they would have had to the mortuary temples on the West Bank. Although the mortuary temples, they probably had access during certain times of the year. I would have thought less than the state ones. The state ones are going to have a lot more festivals.
An in-question question about, do you know any examples of the rekhyt symbol surviving in 3D rather than just the 2D depictions?
Yes. There's 3 bronze statues in which you have a child deity, Harper-Harad, who's holding a lapwing in his hand. That's about as close as I think you would be able to get to the 3D images.
But you do get 3D statues of children holding a lapwing, but I suppose you can't really connect that.
Not holding a lapwing.
Well, holding a little bird.
Holding a little bird, yes. But the bronze statues of Harper-Harad, and I'll include them in my article, he's holding a lapwing.
Fab, thank you. Could you summarize again your theories on the social classes represented by these groups?
Well, I wouldn't say they're my theories, not at all. In fact, I don't really like putting the whole social classes aspect on the Egyptian population, because I think, again, we're perhaps putting too much of a Western perspective on things, and we don't have any texts that tell us specifically the different social classes, as I've said. But Egyptologists will describe the Pat people as being the elite, the rekhyt people as being the lower class citizens of Egypt, and the Henmemet people as being a priestly bunch of people. Whether that's true or not, again, we don't really know. They may all be just, as I say, probably different tribes to begin with, and then they just became designations for Egyptian people. Just multiple words for it.
And are there any indications of the criteria by which the rekhyt were selected for accession during festivals?
Not that we're aware of, nothing at all. I'd love an inscription that would tell us something like that. Because clearly, if they are the ordinary people of Egypt, they can't all have access to the courtyard. You would have probably got 100 or so in there. Who selects who gets inside? We don't know, and probably never will.
Or how much does it cost?
Or how much does it cost? But if they are the lower class citizens, how could they possibly have afforded it?
I'm going to just ask one more. There's quite a few questions, but I'm aware we've been here 2.5 hours now and people probably want their tea. So as a tradition on your Sunday lectures, we ask you what you're having for tea. So we'll finish with that one, but one more rekhyt question. Have there been any comparative studies done on the other people? Such as
There's been short articles on the Henmemet people, but nothing detailed. I think it would make a good PhD topic, and the same with the Pat people. So if any aspiring students are looking for a topic, then there you go.
And there's plenty more questions. If any of them are pressing, are you happy for people to email you?
I'll go through some of them now. So I see one has said about the standing man with the rabbit head. Really interesting one that comes from Philae. If you send me an email, I can give you the specific text for that. The hieroglyph itself, I had to custom create in JSesh because the hieroglyph doesn't exist on there. So yes, it is. I'm not surprised that you haven't seen it before. I don't know of any others, but there could very well be more of it in the publication from Juncker and Winter on the temple. What else we got? The Stele of Nebre, was it from Zawiat el Rakim? No, it's a different one. I'm not sure where that one was found actually, but it's been around for over 100 years, I think now, and is now in the Berlin Museum. But there's the very famous statue, of course, of Nebre from Zawiat el Rakim, which is now in Luxor Museum. I don't think it's the same guy. Nebre is a very common name. Where was that amazing Sekhmet piece from? I don't remember which Sekhmet piece that was. You'll have to email me about that, Aris.
We did have a question about the idea that the rekhyt symbol was used to warn robbers that there's radiation within the tombs.
Well, you know, I put that in the Q&A, or the poll thing as one of the options. Yes, the reason why I put that there, but that's actually a real suggestion that has been proposed before. Some of you may have seen the Face of Tutankhamun documentary that I've mentioned before, and at one stage they talk about the curse of the pharaoh and how the tombs were had these curse inscriptions, etc., for anybody getting in there. Well, you have an Egyptian scholar on there who says that this symbol of the rekhyt rebus was actually an indicator that going beyond this point indicated that there was radiation. Make with that what you want, but it's certainly not one that I would agree with. Marissa has asked, if the columns with the rekhyt are on the east side of the Ramesses court, are there other types of peoples in the same place on the west side of the court for balance? No, the ones on the opposite side simply have the cartouche of the pharaoh, which is in between the leaves. Why it's different, I don't really know. Maybe it was just a stylistic change that you've got there, but it doesn't balance it out, which you would usually expect in ancient Egyptian art. What else have we got there? Yap has asked about the crowning scenes of Hachipset in the Red Chapel, in which you've got the god Amun-Re placing the fear in the hearts of the rekhyt people and the 9 bows. Is fear a command, a device means if the rekhyt are necessary for the maintenance of the cosmos? Fear, I have a section in my book on the thesis on fear. It's a very, very common word that you find associated with the rekhyt people. You usually have it in the hearts of the rekhyt people or the Pat people or Henmamet. So very common. Again, I think at one stage I thought, well, it'd be nice to actually do a full study on the different words that are used to describe the rekhyt people, including fear, etc. But maybe I've had enough of the rekhyt for now. Where was the portion of the world map from? Where did it disappear to? And it was the other one that had the world as a circle. It's now in Yale Museum, the University Museum there. It was published in 1958 by Claret when it was in an auction shop in Luxor, I believe, or might have been Cairo at the time, and then it disappeared. And just a few years ago, I found a publication in which it had the photograph in it, which I was very, very excited to have found. Yep, as an excellent question here on the pilgrim gouges and whether they were allowed to, as they destroyed the texts. And this is a good question. Now, the pilgrim gouges of the, let's say, the pharaonic period, would they have been over the inscriptions themselves, or would they have perhaps been lower down on the walls where you didn't have inscriptions? I don't know. Certainly the ones that I showed from Medinet Habu, they're over the hieroglyphs. But a lot of those could have been done post-pharaonic period. And I think it would be difficult to say for sure what is post and what is pre. Penny Wilson certainly seems to have been able to show that some of the ones that she excavated from Sais are from the 18th dynasty, which is really fascinating. So I think, is that all of them? All of the questions, at least in the Q&A, as far as
I think you've answered more than enough questions, Kat. I think everyone's ready for their tea and a little lie down after all that. But thank you so much for giving your time this evening, and pretty much every Sunday for the last year, actually, doing different things. It's very greatly appreciated, and thank you so much to everyone for attending.
Thank you for hosting.
The fees you've paid today do really go straight to the Egypt Centre and help keep our lovely little museum afloat. We're so grateful to you all. Our next fundraising lecture is next Sunday, same time. It's a fantastic one. I don't have the title to hand, Ken. It's on music, isn't it?
Let me see if I can share the slide even as well. I'll put it up there, and I'll keep the slide up there.
Thank you. I don't have it to hand.
1 second. Where is it?
And a few people have asked again about the recording. I will be editing the video tonight, and you should receive an email within the next 24 hours with the link to watch it again. I think we all probably need to go through it again to absorb everything. And that was it, music in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, I'll try and keep that on there as well. So
it's going to be an absolutely fascinating lecture. I think we're having some demonstrations.
We're going to have a musical demonstration on some ancient Egyptian, well, replicas of ancient objects, ancient musical instruments, which are going to be played. So very, very excited to see this one. So do come along and join us if you can.
And I've been told that all the rekhyt people adore Ken. I think that's a good note to finish on. So thank you so much, Ken. We'll let you go and have a nice sit down. And let everyone grab some tea.
Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight and supporting us. And of course, a big thank you to Sam for moderating tonight. And hopefully see you all next week. And over
next week.
The events that we have coming up over the coming weeks and months. So thank you all for your support.
Take care, everybody. Are we leaving the room open for a few minutes?
I'll keep the room open for the next 5 minutes or so with the slide showing here.
Fab, thank you.
I need to see it. I'll turn off my camera and mic though. So thank you again, everyone, and see you soon.